Welcome everybody. My name's Virginia. I'm just kidding. Unfortunately, Virginia is not feeling well, and so I am the last-minute pinch hitter moderator on this panel. So I hope everyone offers me a little grace. And but no stranger to public engagement, and we have some fantastic panelists. And Virginia did a lot of planning on this panel, so I think it should go perfectly smooth in her absence. Well, welcome everybody to the panel on public engagement, and with some examples of public engagement gone wrong and some that have gone well. Public engagement, of course, has been a huge priority of the Pipeline Safety Trust for many years. Our previous executive director, Carl Weimer, a real leader on public engagement, and was a co-chair along with Sean Lyon of Marathon on the API 1185 public engagement standard. And, you know, it's long been a value of ours that better public engagement, better two-way communication, listening to each other as different stakeholders will lead to safer pipelines. And it's the spirit that we started and continue this conference. And so this panel is very special to us. I want to start off by letting each panelist introduce themselves. Maybe we can go down the line and give a brief introduction about how you're connected to public engagement and what brings you here.
Okay. Good afternoon. I'm Alan Mayberry, Associate Administrator of PHMSA. As you probably heard from earlier today, I'm a regulator. And that means that, you know, as far as we consider public engagement and public awareness, that is an expectation we have that's, you know, covered in various ways in the Code of Federal Regulations. Very important to have communications to the public and also a way to get it back. And it's an area we're constantly working to improve. There's a lot of good work that started with Pipeline Safety Trust that we've leaned on quite heavily. I know they were the recipient of some TAG grants in the past related to that, and has really insightful citizen groups that were together that looked at ways to improve public engagement. And coming out of that is an initiative that came up more recently on developing a new standard that we'll talk about here in a minute. But anyway, my interest is as a regulator, and I have a lot of other thoughts that we'll cover here in a moment related to why it's so important. So thanks.
My name is Cindy Hansen. I am from Iowa, lifelong Iowan. My siblings and I are Century Farm owners in Shelby County in western Iowa. We are on the proposed route for the Summit carbon pipeline. And so since August of 2021, when we got our initial letter saying that we were on that proposed route, my siblings and I have been educating ourselves and educating the public and our legislators on what we consider to be the hazards, the dangers of these pipelines. And so, yeah, we've kind of been on the front line fighting this.
I'm Irene Leech. I am also a part of a Century family farm that I promised my father and grandfather that we would pass to the next generation in as good or better condition than we got it. There was a proposal to put the Atlantic Coast Pipeline right through the middle of the farm, putting every building we had in the incineration zone, 2 miles after the compressor station. And when we asked to have it moved to the edge of our property and not through the middle of the field that my grandfather had painstakingly terraced 50 years ago, they refused. And that was kind of the pattern that went with the whole thing. I also, in my work life, I am a faculty member at Virginia Tech where I teach consumer studies and am an active consumer advocate. And my property where I work is in the evacuation zone of the Mountain Valley Pipeline, which is currently, they are frantically trying to complete it. So that's where I come with the public participation. I used to work for Cooperative Extension, and so getting audiences and so forth was important in other work that I've done.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Paige Chenevey. I am the Field Services and Planning Manager for Marathon Pipeline. I just wanted to thank PST and everyone for this opportunity. Right-of-way services, public engagement reside within my team, and I'm very proud of the work that we do, but it's this type of environment and opportunity to hear perspectives, collaborate on solutions that really drive why we engage with people. The opportunities should extend beyond this conference and go into our everyday interactions with our landowners and the stakeholders. That's why I'm really excited to be here to share some of the recent developments, what we do within Marathon Pipeline, and what we're working with the industry to do, and the public and the regulators to enhance everyone's ability to collaborate.
Great, thanks everybody, welcome. We're excited to have all of you here. To open things up, if each of you could share an example from your experience of public engagement gone well and or public engagement gone wrong.
I guess we'll by default start in the original order. And by the way, I'm fortunate enough to be up here representing, as I mentioned earlier today, a lot of people who are really on the front lines for the Office of Pipeline Safety, notably our community liaisons. And I think if you look at the history of our role in public engagement prior to, as the evolution of pipeline safety regulations happened, it was never really a focus. And in fact, the focus of the relationship between, say, a pipeline operator and a landowner was more transactional. Nowadays, it's more important than ever that it's more of a relationship and that trust is highly important in that. And there are just numerous examples that we can think of where things got started off on a bad note, and that just ruins it for a long, long time. So it's so important, so critically important for things to go right up front. What are some good examples of it gone wrong? I have a couple I can think of, but there are numerous ones. Starting with the word no is an obvious one. We have got to find a way to get to yes. And when you start with the word no, no, you can't have that, or no, I'm not going to share that with you. That's a difficult, that's not instilling trust. So that's a real important one to overcome. We can find ways, and we'll talk about it a little bit in the new standard that's under balloting, but it should be common sense anyway. You can find ways to get to yes, or to get to a way to share information that is so vital for instilling trust. Another example I'll share, it's more of a PHMSA specific example. As a regulator, we have a role in this too. As I was mentioning earlier today, engagement is so important for us. But there was an issue that Carl Weimer sent us a few years ago related to a landowner who had a question about a pipe, didn't know what was going on with this pipe that appeared to be exposed, that was on their property. And it was, admittedly, we handled it over the phone, and in reality, to make a long story short, we ultimately leaned on our state partner in Michigan to go out there and actually put eyes on it. It ultimately was a drainage pipe, but nonetheless, it's just an example where, we need to, that case, we probably should have been out there and had a visit. That would have helped, would have been a better engagement of the public, and that's just one small specific example. I have others as we go, maybe I'll weave into, but I think that'll do it for now.
So I wished I could say that I'd had some positive interactions with the pipeline company, but I can't say that I have. Interactions gone wrong, though. There's many. The lack of transparency from these pipeline companies, refusing to share safety and risk analysis, refusing to share plume modeling. They say that they will share those things, but only after the construction of the pipeline has been started. And it tells us a lot. in their integrity as a company that they're not willing to work with us and share that information with us, especially since Iowa is having problems keeping EMS workers. It's a rural state. The majority of our departments, EMS departments, fire departments are all volunteer, and we don't have the funding for this kind of project to take care of that. So we need that information, and they're not willing to share. Intimidation tactics with them. Initially, even from the first visits, threatening the use of eminent domain, with them showing up with armed security guards for their visits or to bring the survey crews to our land, suing landowners who have refused survey crews entrance to the ground. It's not just sidearms. They're bringing long guns onto the property and suing landowners and threatening them, asking for injunctions that the landowners can't even be on their own land when the surveyors show up. It establishes a lack of trust from the very start. And harassments. Some landowners are getting 20, 30 calls a week. They're getting multiple visits a day. They're having the land agents sitting on the road next to their property waiting for the landowner to drive in so that they can come ask them for an easement. They're showing up at their workplaces. They're showing up at elderly nursing homes multiple times a week to the point where families have had to ask, have put signs up saying that they're not allowed, and have had to tell staff not to allow these people to enter. So it's, I can't say. I wish I could say we've had some good interactions, but none of them have been positive in our circumstance.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Cindy. I was going to ask for maybe like, what are the two biggest factors that contributed, but there's just so much there. I'm not going to ask you to do that. Irene?
Unfortunately, my story's not any better. It's been almost 10 years that we've been involved in this process, and the outcome for me is that I've lost a lot of trust in my country and what it stands for, what my rights are as a citizen. And I don't see how anyone can believe in the American dream when somebody can come along and take your property without your permission and refuse to consider your use of that property in any way. And I can give you lots of examples of things that have happened. The latest, even though our easement does have something in it that says that if it's not used for 2 years, that we can ask for the easement back and they'll give it to us. Most recently, we've been asked to sign a damage waiver or say that they don't need to do anything else on their property, which they don't. We said, fine, we'll be glad to if you'll give us the easement back. And they said, no, we can't do that. FERC won't let us do that, which is not true because other people have gotten theirs back. But that, and I can second so many of the things that you've said. I said that our farm is 2 miles from where the compressor station was to be, and basically none of the public meetings were held in that community. Yes, the open house had to be. They did have to do a meeting around the compressor station. They chose to do it in February, and it snowed the day before. And many of us asked that it be delayed. I lived 2 hours away and had to be at work the morning after the meeting, and I didn't think it was safe. I didn't think I could get home, and my husband travels a lot, and I was, going to not have anybody I could call if I fell in the ditch on the way home. And so I didn't go. They thought it was a very good meeting, but almost nobody was there. Schools hadn't been open. So it's that kind of thing that we've just experienced over and over.
Thank you, Irene. And Paige, before you start, I just want to say, we understand that the industry is not a monolith and every operator doesn't do public engagement the same way or value it in the same way. And we do see Marathon as a leader on public engagement. And so we wanted to invite Paige to share some of how you view public engagement and how it's gone for Marathon.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. I appreciate you making that clarification, and I can speak certainly from Marathon's perspective. And you heard from all three, trust being established, trust being broken, and that's something we really focus on, building the relationship, building that trust. Our program for public engagement is called Earning Your Trust, and that's the commitment that we have, and it's embedded in everything that we do. And one thing I'm hearing is what we focus on is listening and understanding and working through a solution. And we've learned so much, not only from ourselves, but from others. An example, I know Irene had the opportunity to work with a colleague of mine at this very conference several years ago and share some of the stories and concerns, and we embedded those changes into our right-of-way acquisition standard. When we're educating our land agents to go out and do work on our behalf, what they need to consider, what they should be thinking through, the conversations that they have, and then how to engage back with the right level of leadership to help solve some of those problems, but to ensure we have that active listening and that understanding and apply it. I would like to share public engagement, an example of public engagement gone well. We recently had an example where we were trying to get a hold of a landowner, a new landowner, for some work that we needed to do on her property, and she was challenging to get a hold of. And then we received a phone call from her and said she had talked to her tenant farmer, who tenant farms for multiple properties, some of which we have pipeline assets, and he said, Marathon is going to talk to you, they're going to be truthful, they're going to be open, they're going to treat you with mutual trust and respect. And she referred us back and said, I'm ready to have that conversation. So to me, that really, it was a proud moment for me and the investment we've put in developing those relationships, knowing that communities talk and they interact with each other and they rely and trust each other, that we can establish that trust, and then that's shared amongst the community, that we can really be, have a seat at the table, and that you can know that we're coming in to develop a relationship and earn your trust.
Yeah, please, Alan.
Yeah, Bill, I just wanted to add, I noted that I focused on, a couple of negative examples, and you'd asked about positive examples. And as you probably understand, usually when we hear from people, there's an issue. So, the 500 or so inquiries we get across the U.S. with our community liaisons, predominantly they're landowner issues, that people that live near the pipelines. Obviously, they would involve complaints. We don't always hear about the good stories, and that's good in the one sense, but it would be nice to be able to show those. And fortunately, many transactions are good that are out there. Some that come to mind in the aftermath of an unfortunate event, say an incident, as far as the engagement that's happened and taking care of the people who live near where the incident happened, just to reduce the impact. There have been examples of outreach done that are good in that case. I listened to an example this morning related to an accident I visited in Virginia, and certainly I think there is something we can learn from that, because it's just we need to find effective ways to get the message to people, and then have people understand the message, and then show that compassion. Like I said from the beginning, starting with the negative or the no is not the way to start, or starting with the transaction where you only hear from the right-of-way agent up front and not really from somebody who's really has a vested interest in the company. That's probably not the best way to start a relationship, a long-term relationship, for somebody who's going to live next to your pipeline. But I just wanted to make sure I covered the positive too. Anyway.
Yeah, thanks. And I would add, PHMSA obviously has a role in public engagement as a regulator of the operators, but you also have a role in public engagement as an agency that serves the public. And I would count, the meeting in Freeport after the LNG accident and the CO2 meeting in Des Moines as successes on PHMSA's part on public engagement as well.
Yes, I mean, I mentioned those this morning, and, those we're really proud of the events. And as I mentioned too, they're a resource. For a small agency, they take a lot of work for us to put on. They're very valuable, and we'll invoke those when we can, but again, we are resource constrained, and that's probably a limiting factor right now for us to do more of that.
I want to ask, in your role, whichever it might be, public, industry, or government, what do the other stakeholders most commonly not understand about engaging with you? Maybe we could start with Irene.
I would say that the thing that they most often don't think about is what their decisions are costing me in terms of my time and my money. And there are a lot of folks who cannot participate in a process because it's held during a workday. Or it's held so far away, or the community that I live in, the company had a 35-year employee who happened to be chair of the Board of Supervisors. They passed a resolution of support before the pipeline was made public. When we found out and asked them to rescind that, they refused. And from that point on, it was the county and the company against the rest of us. We didn't feel heard. We didn't feel respected. And that is a real problem. The Mountain Valley Pipeline experience that was happening simultaneously at that point and is now still continuing, I can tell you sadly that folks in that community are not finding anything different. And they're not able to get the information that they need. And so if we could just change the way folks look at it, and instead of treating us like we're the enemy from the very first engagement, and recognizing that the property that we have, the goals that we have, the history that we have, not making fun because we see it as heritage and not just something you can trade around for dollars. There are definitely ways that you could approach landowners that would be more effective than what we've experienced in Virginia.
Thanks, Irene. I'd like to begin and end with the public, so let's go to Paige next.
Sure. What I really want folks to understand is we are committed to building relationships that are built on two-way communication, mutual respect and trust, and sharing of truthful and timely information. Again, two ways. And that relationship is really critical to ensure that that lifelong relationship starts off on a good point, but we also need to ensure pipeline safety, and having that trust and respect and the ability to share information back and forth is really, really critical for that. And if I could put a plug in here for RP 1185, so that's the API recommended practice for pipeline public engagement that the industry, the public, and the regulators have been working on for the past 2 years. It sets forth that expectation to start that conversation early and start it from a position of seeking to understand and developing a relationship that's going to last through the life cycle of the asset. It's built on trust and respect both ways, and it opens the door for how you can get to yes, as Alan was sharing earlier. How can you get to yes and work through challenges and concerns, but make sure that that's foundational in building a relationship and maintaining a relationship moving forward. And we all know when you go into working with someone, if you want it to be successful, it has to be more than just transactional. That relationship is really, really critical. And I believe RP 1185 will be really instrumental in helping all operators, regardless of where they are in their journey, moving in that direction, including ourselves. We reflected on where we have opportunities to continue to improve, and the RP is going to help us get it there as well.
Yeah, thanks, Paige. And we'll talk about 1185 a little bit, but I'm glad you brought it up. Alan?
Yeah, as far as misunderstanding, probably, I mean, that's pretty easy. Right up front, I would say, we don't run inline inspection tools or do corrosion testing of pipelines. We monitor operators' actions to run those types of tools. We do have some tools that we use to measure, say, welds and things like that, but typically, when we say we are inspecting a pipeline operator and all of their procedures that they're doing, watching their practices, their records, and the like, but we're not running the tool that we expect them to run. And that's probably one area we deal with, but that one usually we clear that up right up front. The other is related to siting, and I think there's a great understanding now, better understanding, really thanks to your leadership, Bill, and engagement with the public too, of what our role is related to pipeline safety as opposed to siting, which is can be confusing for an interstate natural gas pipeline. It's the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. They approve the siting of pipelines, interstate pipelines, but if it's intrastate pipeline, it reverts to the state level. But we have the safety role, so we're kind of joined at the hip, and then the states, we're there to answer safety questions that may come up if we're involved in scoping meetings that FERC typically has, to assist them as they do their business in determining the need for the pipeline. We're there to answer any safety questions that may come up. But those are just the two basic misunderstandings. I would also like to put a plug in for 1185, and appreciate Marathon's leadership on that committee through Sean Lyon, who's one of the co-chairs, along with Carl Weimer. That document, that standard that's up for balloting right now, looks like it's going to be successfully balloted. Really represents a great standard, a great model to follow. And we see it as a model to follow as a regulator as well. There's a really cool framework in how to get to yes, if you will, on sharing information in that.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. Cindy?
So I think you have to look from the very start of these projects, from the theory of putting a project together and that it's going to work, to the development of it, and then into the practice of it. I think there's a lot of lack of inclusion in participants when these are done. I know from the landowner's standpoint, the lack of inclusion for small farmers, small landowners was very apparent in Iowa when it came to these CO2 pipelines. There was a governor's CO2 sequestration task force that was formed before landowners were even notified that such a project was proposed for Iowa. It was heavily laden with industry people from the CO2 pipeline companies to ethanol plants to agri industries, and a few big, large corporate landowners and a couple of professors from universities. But there were no small landowners, no small farmers that were involved with this task force to even get our input about these pipelines being developed, because the majority of Iowa that is involved with these proposed pipelines are small farmers, small landowners, and we're the ones that are going to be truly affected by it and take on the risk of having these pipelines go through our ground. So a lot of lack of communication, I think, was a lot of it.
Specifically for the public members, Cindy and Irene, I'm curious which components of pipeline safety have you been most concerned with, and how have you felt that the operators and the various government agencies have taken those concerns?
Do you want to go first? So my background is as a critical care nurse for over 32 years. I'm retired now, but I feel like in that time I probably understand the physical effects of what CO2, which is the pipeline that I'm most involved with, how that affects the anatomy and physiology of the human body. And so the risk of a pipeline major leak or rupture, and what it would do to human life and even to livestock and wildlife is a major concern for me, and especially in rural Iowa, which is where these pipelines will transverse. Our EMS system is lacking. Our hazmat systems, we have 19 regional hazmats in the state of Iowa that cover 99 counties. Some of those hazmat teams cover up to 11, I believe 11 counties. And so they've got a large area that they have to cover. And what we've been told is if there's a rupture, our rural EMS fire departments, they would coordinate off the area and keep people out and wait for hazmat to show up. It could be an hour, hour and a half before hazmat gets there. If you've got a rupture and you've got people trapped inside that zone, they don't have an hour and a half to wait. They've got seconds or minutes, depending on how close they are to that rupture site, depending on the landscape, the winds, how fast that plume of hazardous gas would travel. So we also have large livestock confinements in Iowa. Some of these hazardous pipelines would travel within 200 feet, and you may have $1 million worth of hogs in a confinement. If that ruptures, those hogs are dead. And that could destroy some of these farmers' livelihoods. They could not afford that. Soil and water safety, I actually did an experiment. I took a compressed CO2 canister or cartridge, injected it down into our soil on our farm, and injected it into Silver Creek water, which is the creek that runs next to us. I did pH samples before, and I did pH samples afterwards. The pH dropped significantly, making the water in the soil much more acidic. And we kept those samples, I kept them for 3 weeks. I probably should have kept them longer, but at 3 weeks, they were even more acidic. So if you're trying to farm that ground, if you have a water source, if you have a well, and you have a rupture like that, you're dealing with safety hazards. And Iowa's soil, sorry, I'm kind of going on here. Iowa's soil is known for its lead content, cadmium, arsenic, and uranium. And so if you are making the water in the soil more acidic, you're going to leach out those into the soil, those minerals and molecules into the soil and into our water. And if it's going downstream into one of the drinking water sources, then you have the risk of those toxicities getting into your drinking water. You also have the risk of increasing the cost to purify that water for those cities that are using it. So there's just a huge myriad of safety issues, I think, for me.
And Irene, and also if you could, Irene, address how you felt the operator has reacted to or responded to your safety concerns.
Okay. I'm going to use the Mountain Valley pipeline that's under active construction and that I live and see every single day where I work. And we just have so many concerns about safety related to that pipeline. Much of the pipe has sat out for 5 or 6 years. The coatings have been there that long. We really are worried about whether they're going to be safe. the way that things are getting welded. Now that when we started the process, they said the pipe could only sit out for 6 months. And they explained in both pipelines, I mean, when we went to court with the ACP for the eminent domain, they listed billions of dollars about having to move equipment and not working all the way through and building it in one piece. And the Mountain Valley has been built in segments. And it's really kind of unbelievable. I watched at Christmas time several years ago when workers were trying really hard to finish up what they needed to do so they could go home for Christmas. And I remember watching the top of the mountain near me where they were putting in the pipe up until 11:30 at night with lights and so forth. They were back by 5 in the morning, and they were working like that 7 days a week. It was sleeting the night that they were putting the pipe in up at the top of the mountain. I don't know that I'll ever feel safe about how that was installed and about whether it's still safe. And I think you'll find that people along the Mountain Valley have concerns all along. In terms of what the company has done, PHMSA has made an agreement with them, which we're not allowed to see all of and understand. But basically, the company has not, from what I have seen, made any efforts to make us trust it. In fact, the workers seem to sometimes follow some of our people. They take our pictures anytime we happen to be anywhere near the pipeline. One of our folks said she could, with her binoculars, could see that they had people who were specifically on her property watching for when she came outside and communicating that. They would look at her, and then when she went to look, they turned their back. So we haven't had a very good experience with response from the company to this point. I guess we'll see what happens. There are a number of people here from West Virginia and Virginia. I don't think we've got anybody from North Carolina, but you could talk with them about what experiences they've had and what friends of theirs have and so forth.
Thanks, Irene. Paige, could you share a bit about how you and Marathon approach members of the public with their safety concerns?
Certainly. So I'll talk through kind of the life cycle of the pipeline as well as we talk about this, because establishing that trust and answering those questions very early on, especially if you're a landowner that has not had experiences to pipeline in the past, you likely have a lot of questions. So that engagement with the right-of-way specialist that intimately knows the inner workings of Marathon Pipeline, our robust integrity management plan, what our practices are, is willing to share and walk through that process with the landowner so that we can answer the questions that they might have regarding the safety. Pipeline safety is paramount to everything that we do. And that's not just on the shoulders of the right-of-way specialist, but every employee at Marathon Pipeline it's foundational and rooted in that. And one of our guiding principles is to be guardians of public safety, and we take that true to heart. And so we embed that in all of our communications with our public, specifically landowners as they have questions. So we'll work through that in pre-construction and through commissioning when the pipeline starts operation. And then we will have activities perhaps throughout the life cycle, and we will come through with the right-of-way specialist and have a specific conversation with the landowner about what they can expect, what they're going to see, how we can answer any questions that they might have, and then that will continue all the way through the the end of a life cycle of, if we have a decommissioning of a pipeline, work through what that looks like, what the process is, answer any questions that they might have. I'm happy to walk through our integrity management program, how we learn, how we incorporate the learnings not only from our own incidents, but the incidents as others as well, and from other industries even incorporated into the program. But it all is foundational in that relationship and that trust and that open communication, the getting to yes. One of the best parts of RP 1185 is a diagram that Carl Weimer helped put together that leads all questions to getting to yes. Trying to provide as much information as possible to the landowners to satisfy the questions they may have and the concerns.
Yeah, thanks, Paige. I want to take a few minutes before we go to audience questions and just talk about 1185 for just a couple minutes. We had a longer session on it at last year's conference, and hopefully next year's conference we'll have another long session because it'll be adopted and implemented, and we'll have lots more to talk about. But we are in this kind of in-between time right now. First off, I do want to compliment API. They, they put this group together of industry, government, and public, and they got true members of the public for this effort. They did not get, quasi-industry folks. They got people in the room that spoke their mind, and it was it was a conflict-heavy process, but that can be great. That I'm a big believer in that, and I thought where we are now is really positive, and I want to thank API for not being afraid to have those vocal members of the public as part of that working group and that caucus. So these are the core principles that came out of that, and I don't know, Alan, if you want to just take a couple minutes to, as a member of the 1185 working group, maybe talk a bit about what you think is most important out of this as we move towards hopefully implementing 1185.
Yeah, sure. Well, there's so much to talk about here. From the very beginnings of the process, again, I too applaud API for the process that was used to develop this standard and just for starters, the broad array of stakeholders present that were truly, very diverse. We had looked at, and we felt the need to exert leadership in this area, and we originally considered setting up our own working group to develop a public engagement standard or guidance that would inform us. But at the time, in the last administration, we weren't really setting up groups that looked like federal advisory committees. So in, working with the different stakeholders and talking to Carl at length, we ended up settling on, not settling, but it ended up being a very viable process, the API process that we worked through that involved a number of stakeholders. So that was the setup for beginnings of developing the standard. Probably a couple of the most important areas that were talked about, I'll tell you some of the most tricky spots. Probably the trickiest spot relates to that flow chart that Paige was referring to that was ultimately developed by Carl. It started out, and I can remember it well, some of the meetings where there was a lot of cussing and discussing about a list of what kinds of things you share. And of course, as a regulator, I think, hey, once I give you a list of things I want, I'm always going to miss something. So that didn't seem to be too workable for me. And then, others would think, oh, well, I can't share that or that or that. So we ultimately backed up, and Carl came up with this snazzy flow chart, which engineers tend to love, I know, but it really developed a good framework to get to yes, as we've been saying. So that's an important aspect of it. And I've dealt with the issues as well related to getting information and unredacted information and the like. There are ways to get there. I think the inclusiveness was talked about a good bit as well, and it's important, a way to, focus on different groups, underserved groups. I thought that was very important in this initiative. And we later had Kirk join the team and just provided awesome input and was a great resource in that area. Also included equity. I think that's about it. Last year, one thing, we wanted to be successful. So our focus as a regulator is to watch its implementation and and just, much like, and we like the connection that the standard has to safety management systems, the strong dose of that, so important that we want to see it be successful. Whether or not we adopt it down the road, that remains to be seen. We have, just as I mentioned this morning, a lot of things we're working on, but down the road that could be something, but it's not something right out of the block we're going to do, but we're going to be watching closely as far as how it's embraced and implemented.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. And I'll say from my perspective, one of the things I'm excited about as I hear the stories from Cindy and Irene, and I look forward to having some sort of standard that as the public we can point to. These experiences are, objectively awful, but there's a lot of other experiences where it's so hard right now without a standard in place to say this is not good engagement and why isn't it good engagement. And so when the standard is in place, I think it is really going to help the operators, of course, be better at public engagement. But for the public's perspective, I think it's going to give us, a standard to hold operators accountable to engage with us better. So I'm looking forward to it. I think we are ready for audience Q&A. We have a couple microphones going around. Is there a second microphone?
Hi, my name is Charles Davison. I'm from the San Francisco Bay Area. There's a CCS project that was just recently proposed to us to go from 3 power plants in phase 1 and phase 2 would be the 5 refineries there, and then going across the Carquinez Strait into a marshland area and burying it. And the most interesting thing I saw today visually was the experimental release from a CO2 pipeline that showed the ground-hugging effect of CO2 in terms of normal air. It's definitely heavier than air, and it's quite visible that way when you see it as an explosion from the pipeline. It reminds me of the Lake Nyos disaster where the volcanic lake erupted because of a landslide and emitted hundreds of thousands of tons of CO2. That CO2 traveled up to 16 miles away down mountain valleys. And so this can be contained in actually a transportive way just by the topography of the land. And so I wanted to know if there's like a large CO2 supercritical pipeline, how much CO2 would be released per minute and how long it would take to shut that off. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that. I don't know that this is the best panel for that. I know a lot of that information was submitted to the hearings in the Midwest about the total volume in a pipeline depending on diameter and density and things like that. And so please reach out to me afterwards, and I'm happy to talk to you about that. And I don't want to speak for the panel, but okay.
Hi, my name is Jamie Wallace, and I am here with the Unity Council for the East Palestine train derailment. Even though, ours was a slightly different disaster, we have many pipelines that run through our communities too. And, one of my questions is, do these companies do like an analysis or a case study of the response to see what went right and what went wrong in a response to one of these disasters? I think there's a lot to be learned. Looking back is always 2020 to see how to handle these disasters in the future. And kind of like some of the panelists had said, this has actually, made me lose faith in my government. 5 tankers of vinyl chloride was blown up under my community. And as Cindy's sitting up there talking about the health effects, I'm thinking, oh, don't worry about it. They told us our water's clean and our soil's fine and our wildlife's okay to eat. So I just wondered how much you guys look into that. And also that, when you're thinking about these different like emergency response plans and communication, I feel like it's very important that you get to know the community. We have a large population of elderly people, a very rural area, the technology, that they're coming in with QR codes, and we have people that don't even know what a QR code is. And also knowing, that this is a lot of our land is generational land. We've always taken care of our land. I feel like when Norfolk Southern came in, they thought we were a bunch of backwoods people, which we are, but we also have a very deep-rooted value of family. When it comes to our families, we'll fight any way we can. And we also have knowledge of that land. You can't tell me that you poked into my creek for years, it's legacy chemicals, and, still 9 months later, this volcano of chemicals come out. I've fished in those creeks. I swam in those creeks. I think the big thing that Norfolk Southern went wrong is community engagement is not PR. That is not what people want to hear. I would rather hear the cold, hard truth of maybe we don't know. I'd rather hear that than just have the human health issues ignored. So I guess, do you guys look at those past experiences?
So I can speak on behalf of Marathon Pipeline and what I've seen from operators. We do critically look at both our responses and incidents as well as others, and look at that. What could go well? What can we learn from? And we integrate that into opportunities. You made an excellent point that community engagement during an incident is different. And we are very committed to that. And we dedicate a lot of resources to that community because we know there's going to be a lot of questions and a lot of concerns. And we need to have individuals sitting with you at your table, hearing your questions and your and providing you information readily and as real time as we have available to us.
Human health response. I'm sorry, that's just another major thing that I see is lacking is there's no, especially in the rural communities, like you said, when the closest trauma care is 40 miles away. Like I feel like we look at the response, but not that human health response. Getting people in there 9 months later to study us while we've been soaking these chemicals is not acceptable.
Yeah, we work very closely with, during a response, we work very closely with local public health, state public health, EPA, to understand what those concerns are, what that follow-up should be. A lot of that is done during the emergency response planning phase to identify hospitals and local, but we will work very closely with local public health to identify what those needs would be.
Also, if I could add, in the federal regulations, we have requirements for operators to have emergency response plans, and it's our expectation that they test those plans. It is an area that we look at in the aftermath of if the worst happens. Certainly that figured in the Satartia case where there was a CO2 pipeline failure where we addressed some shortcomings in that response. And those are provided as lessons learned, but like I was mentioning this morning, we really need, you can have the best processes in the world, but you really need to have the culture to live it and think about what can happen next to prevent that next accident.
So if I can quickly say, though, too, from a landowner standpoint, when we have addressed those concerns about the health and safety of people with, I'll just say it, with Summit Carbon Pipeline Solutions, they poo-pooed off our concerns. We'd mentioned Satartia, and they'd said, well, nobody died, and nobody was hospitalized.
Died in a slow, painful death. Nobody died immediately, but with the cancers it causes, people did die.
Well, with Satartia, since it was a CO2 rupture, so nobody died, and they said, nobody was hospitalized. But if you look at it from a nursing standpoint, hospitalized, they can say that technically because you have to be admitted to the hospital. I mean, it's kind of an insurance term to be considered hospitalized. But you can be put in the hospital for 48 hours as an observation patient, but you weren't technically admitted. And multiples of these people from Satartia spent that time as observation patients in the hospital. And many of them today are still suffering from anoxic brain injury to the point where they can't function on their own. They have to have permanent caregivers because they can't drive, because they can't, once they get going down the road, they can't remember where they were going. They can't hold jobs. So our concerns have basically been ignored.
You know, in our community, we did a health assessment survey within a mile of the compressor station because nobody else was doing it. And once that happened in Buckingham on the ACP, then I was one of the people collecting data last year this time around the Mountain Valley in the area where, so one of the things that we've discovered through the process is that it becomes important for the community to step in and figure things out sometimes because you can keep asking and sometimes nothing happens. And so we've done it for ourselves.
We've got a question from online, if that's okay right now.
Yeah, real quick, I just want to say some of what we're talking about here, falls out of some people's definition of pipeline safety, but it certainly doesn't fall outside of the Pipeline Safety Trust definition of pipeline safety, and I'm really glad that we're talking about it. Thanks, Aaron.
Good point. Am I on? Yeah.
Yeah.
What makes you think that if a company adopts the voluntary RP 1185, that it will really help prevent the bad sorts of engagement that were described? Who would hold a company accountable if they don't follow the fine-sounding core principles in the proposed voluntary practice on public engagement?
So you heard, if you were in this session before, that there's an element of raising the tide for operators. And we're currently working through an implementation plan to share the mechanisms and the framework to help all operators, regardless of where they are in their journey for public engagement, move forward. So there is a lot of operator to operator within the industry support and encouragement to go down this path, and a lot of conversations that happen in sharing to elevate all boats. High tides raise all boats. So from an industry perspective, it's a bit of that peer-to-peer influence to encourage folks to go along that way.
But the questioner is right. We, the public, are still concerned because it's voluntary and the industry is the one implementing. And that is a problem for people who aren't sure. And the culture's got to change. We've got to get to a point where the people who are doing this truly value the landowners and truly want to have that ongoing relationship that you describe. And it doesn't just happen. And so the whole industry needs to look at things in a new way. The regulators, the whole thing. So anyway, I think that's part of what's behind that question.
Yeah, and I do also I encourage all of you to look at the RP when it's published, and as the public, that is, and you mentioned it, it's what you should be expecting from operators as you're engaging with them. So definitely take that RP and read through it and understand what you should expect if you have questions or concerns or you have a new pipeline coming on your property.
And our expectation is that operators are engaging. What can make our life easier as a regulator is to make sure that engagement's effective, because we are hearing the complaints that it isn't, or in certain cases it's not effective. So that's the best thing an operator can do, is really lean into that area. And certainly programs like Build Your Trust and the branding of that, I think, is quite helpful. Yes, until it's adopted in federal code, it's a voluntary standard like many others that are out there. It's not been finalized yet. There's a process we go through to look at all new standards. But our expectation is, regardless of whether or not that standard is implemented, we expect effective engagement, effective communications with landowners. And we have a history of taking action if we don't see that done correctly. The basic building blocks are in the code. What I see the RP doing, and really the other RP on 1162 called public awareness for that matter, those really dial in prescription, but the requirements are there in the code to have an effective program to engage the public. If there's shortcomings in it, we take a look at it and we act on it.
Good afternoon. My name's Jillian Giannetti. I'm a senior attorney with the Natural Resources Defense Council in Washington, D.C. Question for the panel. what coordination is PHMSA and the operators doing with FERC with respect to public engagement and, you know, that soup to nuts approach that you were talking about, Paige, of like starting from the very beginning? Because based on the conversations I've had with landowners and community members, getting to yes for an operational pipeline is easy. They've been begging for safety operators to come out and do inspections and look. The hard thing is that trust has already been completely eroded through the permitting process. When you talk about getting to yes in the permitting process, you have to keep in mind that only one person is there voluntarily. This is a transaction where one person wants to be there and one person is being forced there. So I'm just curious what you're doing to keep that in mind, because I think you would have a much more successful time on the operational side if that trust hadn't already been destroyed through the siting phase.
Now, you make an excellent point, and that's, you know, been our philosophy with the Marathon Pipeline, to start those relationships early through that communication and building that trust very early on in the process while you're in pre-construction phase. But the RP itself does address all phases of the life cycle. It doesn't exclude the PHMSA section versus the FERC section. It does, it encompasses the entire life cycle of the pipeline asset.
And you know, if they couldn't come to us with the very first contact saying, and if you don't agree, we're going to use eminent domain, we're going to, you know, they don't come to us till they've already made most of the decisions, and they don't want us to interrupt anything at that point. So there's got to be a change on that level.
And just in general, with FERC, we have a memorandum of understanding with them, but we typically attend scoping meetings, not all projects, but the ones certainly that are controversial. We typically are there to answer any safety questions, but that's just to help in the scoping process. But, you know, like I said up front, I think that first interaction is just so critical to establishing trust right up front in the life cycle.